Hey guys, Tomato Justice. A friend of mine came up to me the other day and he heard about this crazy video game story, a historic video game story, and I was like, you didn't know about that? But I guess a lot of people didn't, and I thought it would be fun to share the story, even though it's very well known, because I went over and looked at this story, and it's pretty interesting to look at the specifics. Anyway, I'm talking about the story of the 1983 Atari video game Burial. This is one of the most famous video game industry history stories that's around. It's awesome. So, the story of the 1983 video game Burial, Atari video game Burial, is really about what happened in 1982. Now, let's just get a little bit of background. Atari was purchased by Warner Communications in 1976 for $28 million. Okay, this is just like very early on, obviously 76. Not much video games out. And it exploded into success, okay, with the release of the Atari 2600 in 1977, and the ports of arcade games, which were very popular, Asteroids, Space Invaders, Missile Command. It was extremely popular. In fact, in the late 70s and early 80s, the term for console was Atari. People weren't using the term video game console, really. People were just saying, an Atari. And Atari, obviously, was very successful. By 1982, its net worth had grown to more than $2 billion from $28 million in 1976, just, 6 years earlier? That's unbelievable amount of growth. And adjusted for inflation, that's $5.6 billion, which is bigger than EA is now, which is crazy. So, and in 1982, they accounted for 80% of the video game market. So, unsurprisingly, they expected things to continue growing at this massive rate. And they did what had worked in the past. In 1982, they made another port. They ported Pac-Man to the 2600, and this was released in March. And they expected sales to be so high that they manufactured 12 million cartridges of Pac-Man, even though they knew they'd only sold 10 million Atari 2600 consoles. So they were expecting Pac-Man to be so popular that it would drive sales of an extra 2 million 2600 consoles. And though it was still the 2600, it was still its best-selling title. They sold 7 million copies, and while that held the crown as the best-selling video game for years to come, it wasn't beaten out until the year 2000, actually, by The Sims, which sold 12 million copies. Even though it was that successful for a way, they were still left with 5 million unsold cartridges, and it wasn't as successful as they thought because it was panned for its poor gameplay. Believe it or not, it had wonky controls, which you'd think you could, get the 4 directions in Pac-Man, but believe it or not, it was panned for its poor gameplay, and people were returning the game at an unusually high rate due to the gameplay issues. So they were left with these 5 or so million unsold cartridges. And then later in 1982, Atari released one of the first games ever to be based on a movie, a game titled E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Now, they'd spent over $25 million on the rights to this game alone, and they expected sales to be so good that they'd produced over 5 million cartridges of this game. And when this game was released, it was also critically panned and is now notorious as one of the worst games ever made. So they had these 2 absolutely massive botched game releases. And it prompted retailers to demand official return programs from video game manufacturers, not just Atari, that exist to this day. That was how bad of a failure these 2 games were. in terms of what they expected to sell and what they actually sold. So of the 5 million copies manufactured of E.T., only 1.5 million copies were sold. So now, in addition to the Pac-Man debacle, Atari's holding on to over 8 million completely useless, expensively produced cartridges. They're just in a warehouse. Now, in addition, earlier that year in 1982, Atari had been so confident in its sales that they had told distributors, place your orders for 1982 all at once. And and sales of video games also happened to drop that year for other reasons, as well as, the industry as a whole. And so, and it was due to also unknown at the time, there was a market saturation taking place. Excuse me. So, in addition to these two massive flops, distributors returned another huge quantity of unsold stock. So, while expected company growth for 1982 had been... for 1983, expected company growth had been 50%. By the time 1982 was over, Atari's earnings had only increased by 10%, so it wasn't looking very good. And they were sitting on a pile of 9 to 11 million useless, unsold game cartridges. Somewhere around that number, 9 to 11 million. Just sitting around in a warehouse. So, what were they going to do with them? Well, in 1983, September 83, Atari took these 10 or so million cartridges, most of which had been sitting in a storehouse in El Paso, Texas, and they drove them on 20 semi-trailer trucks to a landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico, where over the course of the month, they were dumped, crushed, and finally encased in concrete. And they did so much dumping that month that the city of Alamogordo protested, and the dump manager, he was forced to make Atari stop dumping, and the city later enacted legislation that would limit that kind of massive industrial dumping because they were just doing truckload after truckload after truckload of video games dumped into a landfill. So, by the end of 1983... Atari had lost over $530 million, and it was sold off by its parent company, Warner Communications. This causes panic in the industry, and, end of the story, due to this, which happened over the course of 1982, and a few other factors, this sends the whole industry into the famous 1983 North American video game industry crash. And this is where the game industry imploded. And from 1983 to like 1985 or something like that, the industry destroys itself and revenues drop by 97%. It goes from being like a $3 billion industry to being like a $100 million industry. So it's just, the industry just completely fucks itself. And it wasn't saved until 85, 87 with the widespread success of the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System. But that is another story. So I just wanted to share that story. I know it's a lot of, cool info there. It's just pretty interesting what that, the whole state of the industry was back then. Back then, Atari, video games were so new. No one knew what was going. People thought that, it was just going to increase and increase, and people didn't really have a sense that there was a market of gamers and a market of other people. They just saw this sort of new medium, and they were just like, well, we'll just make millions and millions and millions and millions, and of course everybody's going to want this. But they didn't realize that there's like actual gamers out there and actual non-gamers out there. So there was like a market saturation that the 2600 experienced, where they'd really had sold as many as they were going to, but they didn't realize it. They thought that they were going to just continue selling and growing and growing. And that, along with the failure of the, the Atari 5200, something like that. And it was the Atari 5200. that didn't sell very well after the Atari 2600 was really the last Atari, successful console. And, the game industry recovers by the end of the 80s with the release of the NES. And then in the mid-90s, it explodes again and continues to rise. And now we have what we have today, which is just a continued growing industry, an industry that was, thought to be recession-proof. I don't know if anyone remembers that at the beginning of the recession, 2010 or so. The games industry was significantly stronger than the rest of the market, but by the time 2011 rolls on, we see the closure of a number of famous game studios, and now we are where we are today, where we have this number of multi-billion-dollar industries, and very interesting. Very, very cool stuff, and if you didn't know that story, it's definitely a cool kind of tidbit of trivia information that there was once, 10 million copies of video games dumped in a landfill. And what's funny about that, too, is the El Paso, Texas storehouse where the games were taken from. It's a storehouse that they had, and then Atari also had a game plant, which was also, it was a game plant where they were making the cartridges in El Paso, and they converted that plant into a recycling plant. Because I assume they also had other materials that there was no longer worth it for them to be creating stuff. They needed to be destroying stuff and recycling things. So, a number of factors. Atari was clearly in a lot of trouble there. This round was pretty crazy. I don't know if you guys noticed at the end there. Grizzle is in this match. He showed up in the server, and I was like, oh, look at that. But pretty intense. A lot of action going back and forth, and I don't know if we just lost. We couldn't quite pull out a win, but we almost pull out that comeback at the end there. I've been using the belt-fed LMGs, the high-damaging ones, the PKP, the M240B, which is in this one, and I've been using the M60 to a lesser extent, really trying to figure them out, using them extensively, and I used to use them a fair amount, I guess, but always thought that attachments like the suppressor, flash suppressor, foregrip maybe, stuff like that is what I would always say would be the best attachments for those because they increase the accuracy, and those things are so inaccurate that you kind of want all the help you can get. But what I have found is that, they're okay accurate, and really you just need that extended magazine to be able to throw as many bullets downrange as possible, because as long as you're suppressing your enemy, they're going to have a really hard time hitting you. And that turned out to be a better strategy, and just being able to, tap firing to get a little more accuracy out of there, and just sort of relying on the fact that you suppress so much to sort of get you out of situations and stuff like that. And it can be a lot of fun at times, just because you can just spray so many bullets onto people, and, sometimes it turns out in your favor. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the little story time, and I will see y'all later.